Okay, we're going to talk about urban freeways. Now, there's only one real rule here, and that is the freeway came second. So let's try and put this in action. Put a highway through an urban area. Now, luckily, these blocks have already been cleared for us. So let's put down some highway here. Put down some ramps. Okay, so we're done. So just remember, build as many urban highways as possible, and whoever has the biggest and most complicated intersection wins Cities Skylines. Don't forget to spend half of your episode on lane markings and traffic control devices. Thanks for watching my YouTube. Here are my Patreons. See you in the next video. Okay, so obviously that wasn't the whole episode. Today's episode is about how urban freeways destroy communities. Now, I could show you a bunch of statistics and data, and maybe some maps and a bunch of facts and other boring stuff like that, and maybe I'd get the point across. Or instead, we could tell a fun story. Let's look at the area we'll be building in today. This is a street I'm going to arbitrarily call 52nd Street. 52nd Street starts at this simple diamond interchange with Interstate 138, then travels through some suburbs to the town of Overbrook and its suburban railroad station, where it jogs north 2 blocks and joins the route of the 52 streetcar at its western loop and its car barn. After the car barn, it passes through some older streetcar suburbs mainly composed of 4 squares and Sears kit houses. The width of 52nd Street allows for dedicated right-of-way for the 52 streetcar, which is part of what led to this area's rapid development. Soon it crosses the city limits, where it meets Sacred Bloody Viscera of the Body of Christ Hung Upon the Cross Catholic Church. Another streetcar line crosses here. Next is an area of denser buildings near the High Street Elevated Railroad Station. A small plaza is also located north of the street near this location. After this, we pass through some older row house neighborhoods with some larger apartment buildings interspersed throughout. These were built shortly after the elevated railroad was. Density tapers off as we approach the recently constructed I-338 highway. The Route 52 streetcar turns back here. It once continued as an interurban, but that company was recently purchased by National City Lines and is now a bus. Now, as a major artery connecting 2 freeways, 52nd Street was identified by local and regional planners as a prime location for a new freeway. The federal government soon approved it, and enough local funding was identified to fully fund the project at an 80-20 federal-local split. Now, the neighborhood to the planners was no major loss. It had been blacklisted by the banks after the construction of I-338 failed to bring the revitalization it promised. 52nd Street was clearly a slum. So plans were developed. The highway would avoid the largest commercial buildings, the car barn, and the Church of the Sacred Bloody Viscera of the Body of Christ Hung Upon the Cross. Otherwise, it was to be an elevated 6-lane highway the whole way through. Now, these plans were presented to the community. Fancy renders were produced. A convincing sales pitch was developed. Promises of relocation assistance and economic aid were made. But the 52nd Street community calmly but firmly said no. At every stage of the process, every plan was rejected by nearly every resident of the community. This, of course, meant nothing to the planners. The bulldozers were revved up, and eminent domain proceedings started. This is Mrs. O'Leary's house. She's a recent widow. She lives alone with her 2 cats. She just paid off the remains of her mortgage, though. She's relying on renting an apartment in the house and her Social Security to pay for her retirement. Her compensation was $50,000 and a Section 8 voucher. And most Section 8 buildings in the neighborhood have strict no pets policies. In this building, Mohammed Ahmed lived. He's a local shopkeeper. He lives above his corner grocery store. He's a devout Muslim. He closes shop briefly 5 times a day to pray. His cat Moses lives in the store, and he doesn't like getting belly rubs from the customers, but he tolerates it. He spent most of his savings on a deposit for the 15-year lease after immigrating to the United States. He's planning on purchasing the building the following year, and he didn't hear about the demolition plans until seeing the permit posted on the building itself, since he was away on the Hajj. His compensation? 2 years' worth of rent, and that's for his apartment, not for his shop, which he gets nothing for. This is a local anarchist commune. The building was purchased by local anarchists 10 years ago. They're not the capitalist kind of anarchists. They hand out free food on Saturdays to all who want or need it. They host art shows highlighting poor and minority artists in the local area. They have weekly classes on Michael Bakunin. They shelter homeless folks, especially queer and trans homeless folks who aren't allowed at local shelters. Their compensation, $75,000, split between 8 co-owners. Nick Lee is a local landlord who owns 7 buildings, 6 of which are in the path of the freeway. He recently completed extensive renovations on 4 of them, financed by the 52nd Street Savings and Loan Company. These buildings are all in the path of the highway. His compensation, $300,000. The 52nd Street Savings and Loan Company. It's a local bank which has resisted takeover by larger national banks. It has 1 branch with the offices above the branch itself. The owners steadfastly follow the 3-6-3 rule. That is, borrow at 3%, lend at 6%, and be on the golf course by 3 o'clock in the afternoon. They only have they are the only bank to lend to the local area, since the area is still blacklisted for mortgages by major banks and the FHA, owing to the fact that the area did not revitalize after the latest freeway was installed. So their bank is demolished, and they decide to just sell the assets to a larger bank rather than try and reopen. This is the 52nd Street Synagogue, as a congregation of 170, mostly living in surrounding blocks, to be demolished for the freeway. The congregation decides to pool their resources and build a bigger synagogue in the suburbs. 150 of the congregation sell their homes and follow the synagogue out to the suburbs. With no financing available owing to the neighborhood's blacklisting and the closure of the 52nd Street Savings and Loan Company, these houses remain abandoned for many, many years. This is where Mike lives. He lived on this block his whole life. This is his dad Mike's house. This is his brother Mike's house. The house his other brother Mike rents out of the discount to his friend Mike. Mike's Hardware, where Mike's dad Mike owns and where Mike still works. This is in friend Mike's house, and this is his other friend Mike's house. And on the corner here is Mike's Confectionaries, which makes such great cannolis. Now Mike lived on this block his whole life, and now it's all gone to this highway. Compensation? None of them got more than $40,000. This is Mrs. Miriam LOUISE'S house. She's a local community and anti-racist organizer. She's a mother of 2. Both Malcolm X and Dr. King have dined at her kitchen table. She led community resistance to the freeway. Her compensation was $65,000. For every story I told here, there are 100 untold stories of renters forced out at short notice, owners receiving ludicrously low compensation for their property, and generally people being screwed out of their lives and livelihoods for the sake of getting 6 lanes of asphalt put in. At any rate, once hundreds of buildings are demolished, the freeway is completed. New parking is installed under the freeway for new businesses that are expected to spring up near the exits. Mysteriously, however, this doesn't happen. The parking lots never quite manage to fill up. Houses near the freeway are put on the market, but with the noise from the new freeway, plus mortgage financing being unavailable due to the closure of the 52nd Street Bank, no buyers can be found. Abandonments lead to more abandonments, and the neighborhood goes into rapid decline that'll last for decades. Now, every urban freeway that exists has a story like this behind it. People's lives are buried in abutments and pillar foundations, whether it's New York, Detroit, or Baltimore. Freeways have choked cities and wrecked neighborhoods. Now, thankfully today, building a new urban freeway is unthinkable, and this is largely thanks to the freeway revolts. Far beyond politely and firmly saying no to a project, organizers of freeway revolts correctly recognize that these projects were meant to go ahead regardless of the opinions of the communities they were meant to destroy. Effective freeway revolts relied on techniques like blocking bulldozers, occupying condemned houses, protesting and interrupting city council meetings regarding the proposed freeway, and mass demonstrations. Typically, these movements would lead to mass arrests and were consistently maligned by the press as irresponsible or as having come too late when plans were available for the previous 5 years, or, the worst condemnation of all, lacking decorum. For instance, in the fight against the Three Sisters Bridge and associated highways in Washington, D.C., a fistfight broke out when City Council approved a highway. That was in the council chambers, I mean. Chairs were thrown, arrests were made. Later, activists occupied condemned houses, and even later, as construction began, over 130 arrests were made as protesters illegally occupied the construction site. As it turns out, though, starting a fistfight in a city council chamber is a more effective protest than politely saying no to a plan. The Three Sisters Bridge was never built. Some freeway revolts were only successful after construction was substantially underway, as in the case of Route 40 in Baltimore, which is now a stub of a highway which bypasses only 12 streets. If these revolts are unsuccessful and the freeway is built, however, it has many knock-on effects and consequences beyond the initial demolitions and displacements. It's an eyesore and is loud as hell, so people begin avoiding the neighborhood. Additional automobile traffic enters the neighborhood from the freeway, leading to an increased demand for parking. Land is easily found for parking, however, in the form of abandoned homes and businesses which can be demolished and reclaimed to store people's cars instead of storing people. Highways were also frequently built through areas planners called slums. The actual condition of the buildings or people was irrelevant. The primary consideration for what was a slum was the density of residential units and also race. We'll talk about this more in a future episode. This meant that highways were built through already blacklisted communities which couldn't obtain financing from big banks for improvements or for mortgages. Improvement in the neighborhood was all but impossible even before the highway, save for those few communities which had local banks willing to lend to their own blacklisted community. After the highway came through, these improvements became even more difficult. You may have noticed the low compensation being offered to the residents earlier. This is for two reasons. The earlier blacklisting the community brought down the fair market value of buildings, but eminent domain proceedings, where the government takes your property and compensates you at fair market value, lowers it further. This is because part of the property value is from speculation. In some areas, it's a larger part than others, of course. Once a property is condemned, there is no reason to speculate on its future value, since you know its future value will be zero. The price falls considerably as a result. So, in short, you're thrown out of your house, given a meager stipend, and have to move your entire life to a new neighborhood where you have no connections, and you also have a limited time in which you can do all of that. And here are a couple other issues which urban freeways cause. They reduce taxable land, thereby reducing tax revenue to the city. They create traffic on surface streets, leading to the need for street widenings, of course at the expense of the pedestrian environment. They're expensive to maintain, and of course they're ugly. My point in this whole episode is urban freeways destroy communities. They do it by destroying buildings and destroying lives. They make rebuilding neighborhoods harder, and they make cities more car-centric and hurt cities financially and physically. Consider this when you're building.